Erica, over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the August 27th, 2020 meeting of the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. Hi, everybody. We have a packed agenda today, which is great. Today, Catherine won't be able to join us because she's on some vacation, but I'm very grateful for everybody joining us this afternoon. So just a quick review of the agenda. We will start off with a presentation by Chris Kaliba from UVM on the Vermont Resilience Matrix, and he is somebody we've been looking to hear from but now we just finally have the chance to, and I'm really looking forward to that. And then we will go into some feedback on the goals that you folks so diligently created that was presented by Chris Cochran at the 823 Climate Council meeting. Then we'll talk through the next step that is needed as it relates to developing strategies and actions underneath our pathways. Remember those pathways? And then we'll get an update from Jane on the stakeholder engagement events that are going on, as well as a land use, an update on how we're going to do multi-committee coordination on land use recommendations. And then we'll have public comment and adjourn. Are there any questions on the agenda, as well as revisions to the minutes from the 820 meeting that are posted in the agenda? Okie dokie. Any pertinent updates from the group before we launch into the presentation? Okay. Well, it is my honor to welcome Chris Kaliba to our subcommittee meeting. I'm going to hand it right over to you, Chris, for your presentation. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. And it's a pleasure. And I'm sorry our schedules didn't align earlier in the summer here, but I'm glad it's still summer and I'm still gotten to you by that time. I had given a version of this presentation to I think it was the Ag Subcommittee of the Council earlier in the summer, and they've encouraged me to share it with you. So as I'm going to take over the screen and show you some slides. And as I'm doing that, just by way of introduction to who I am, as Erica says, I am Chris Kaliba. Let me see whether I can get that up. Is that on? Can you see that? Okay,
yep,
great.
Looks great.
So I'm Chris Kaliba. I'm a professor in community development and applied economics at UVM, and I've been here for over 20 years. I'm a Gund Fellow. Have done extensive research on climate change adaptation around water quality. I've worked with several folks on this line, even on things like transportation research, food, energy, water, systems analysis, and whatnot. So I've got a pretty strong research and academic background in resiliency, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But I'm also the director of the Office of Engagement for the university, and took on that role last summer. And it's really an office that's the front door between the university and external stakeholders. I'm keenly interested in having UVM play a key supportive role in rolling out all the great ideas and initiatives that are coming out of your work and the rest of the council's work. So, as you think about UVM's role in all of this, please look to us as being one of your points. I know you've been connected with Stephen Posner from the Gund, and we work very closely with the Gund, but we also can bring other pieces of the university that may not be touched by the Gund at this point. So I think I'll just leave it at that. So sources of some of the content I'm going to share with you today include some of the work that we have been doing through the Vermont Appscore program. Now, this is an NSF-funded program. It's basically National Science Foundation funding that goes to smaller states to build research capacity. And for the last 10 years, we have been working on water quality issues. The first 5 years was research on adaptation to climate change. The last 5 years has been basin resilience to extreme events. Our major focus has been on harmful algal blooms in Lake Champlain in the shallow bays, but also resiliency as it pertains to water hazards, water quality, more largely expanded. I'm also going to share with you some materials that I use in a class that I teach on systems analysis for community resiliency. We do have a certificate of graduate study in community resilience and planning at UVM that has seen some great success. And as we think about developing the next generation of people that are going to manage the solutions that you're coming up with, we would like to be a source of talent to feed those initiatives going forward. I'm also going to touch on briefly on some work that I've been doing with the International Joint Commission. You may be aware of or not of the Lake Champlain-Richelieu River flood reference. It's a transboundary water planning initiative to help to mitigate flood hazards, particularly as it relates to lake flooding and Richelieu River flooding, but it's got some tangible benefits, I think, for resiliency in our tributaries as well. And I think the bigger piece that I'm going to share with you a bit is that we've done a series of economic resiliency assessment roundtables with experts in the economic and workforce development and social service delivery spaces, public finance and whatnot. Some of these are entities that I don't see a strong connection that have been made yet between those ecosystems and what you're working on, but I'm going to strongly encourage you to do so as we think about the climate economy side of the equation on this. That's where I think those pieces intersect. And if at any point in time that there's something that I'm saying that doesn't resonate or you have questions about, please chime in. So relative to Vermont Appscore, I just want to mention that Vermont Appscore is a statewide entity that's housed out of UVM, but it's connecting pretty much all of the higher education institutions across the state around core research, capacity building, education and workforce development, particularly in the STEM sector and private sector engagement. I want to highlight one of the other features, which is data and data dashboards. We have, over the period of time here, we've developed quite a few dashboards relative to monitoring water quality in Lake Carmine, St. Albans Bay, Missisquoi Bay, and what have you. And we have a variety of remote sensing products that are out there. We also use satellite imagery and what have you. And so as you are thinking about data needs relative to the pathway recommendations, please consider Vermont Appscore and UVM as a data partner in any of those activities. One of the new dashboards that I'm particularly excited about that I think is very relevant to what you're doing is around climate change. And we have a state-of-the-art regional downscale climate model dashboard that we are almost ready to launch. And as soon as it is launched, I will let Marion and the rest of you know that to share. And what this will be able to do is to calibrate and run different GCMs and RCPs for the state and run analyses based on temperature and precipitation and scale down to kilometer scale grids. So Erica was talking a little bit about the micro bursts that occurred. And so in that particular area of Ripton, perhaps there's a propensity for that to happen, right? So with climate change, how much more frequently might those occur? Obviously, we can't predict the number and frequency, but the volume of precipitation and longer term temperature variation. For long range planning, this could be very, very useful. And it could also have some dimensions for particular users. So you can see here that an individual farmer or a commercial establishment could use this tool to anticipate precipitation and temperature averages going out well into the future. We're hoping to design some educational components around this so that people get up to speed on, well, what is a GCM and why is there so much variability between different GCMs, global circulation models, for example. So I just put that out there as part of the data needs that will be needing to be anchoring a lot of the initiatives in your pathway document. So as we think about resiliency, and I'm sure you've, as a committee, have thought about this, is what is resilient? You know, there's a lot of, obviously, our media sees goes to resilient ecosystems, and Mother Earth is quite good at bouncing back in most instances. They may not be bouncing back to the degree that suit human habitat, and that's where those things come across at an intersection, right? We can talk about resilient people, obviously. We all have impacts, COVID, resiliency out of COVID, right? We've had some wonderful workshops this week at UVM as a part of our orientations from some of our wellness leadership, and talking about how the COVID crisis has had impacts on all of us. Same thing with climate change, right? The loss of going through a flood hazard event, or the loss of drinking water supplies when you're hit by a drought, and what have you. So we need to be thinking at that scale, and also thinking about resilient places, difference between urban and rural boundaries, and how urban systems may have different resiliency points and concerns than rural ones. And obviously resilient things like our physical infrastructure, our roadways, our telecom, our utilities, and what have you, our water, drinking water systems, and how resilient they are. And I know that you've been paying attention to all those issues in this committee and across the council. Of course, we can be thinking about resilient organizations and institutions. I think we've all demonstrated some pretty good capacity in this area, but more can be done there. And of course, resilient communities, which I think is your unit of analysis of this subcommittee. As we think about the interconnectivity between the built, social, and natural environments, what I think is most of interest here are the interseas when they overlap. And so I know that you've been thinking deeply about zoning and land use regulations relative to floodplain, or the placement of renewable energy sites, for example. And that's where the social and the natural overlap. We can also be thinking about overlaps between the built and natural systems, and looking for points of ecological vulnerabilities. You know, our floodplains, building in floodplains, relocating in floodplains, zoning in floodplains, for example. And then we think about built and social overlaps as how do we get decision makers and resource providers to resource investment decisions. And of course, at the center of all those overlaps are those areas within our institutional infrastructure, within our built infrastructure, and the ecosystems in our communities that tend to be particular hotspots. So as we think about the effects of climate change on a place like Vermont, we tend to think of it as one state and one unit of analysis, but we do need to think heterogeneously about regional variation, about regional needs, and what have you. And the vulnerabilities of those systems will vary fairly drastically. So, and I'll say a little bit more about social vulnerability in a second. And then, of course, I don't know the extent to which you've done deep dives into terminology and definitions of resiliency, but there are a variety of definitions. Most of them are basically how a system can bounce back after being knocked down, right? And there's a critique in the literature on that, in that keep getting knocked down to have to bounce back. After a while, you stop bouncing back. And so can you reorient systems so that they don't get knocked down in the first place, right? That's the goal. You know, building a resilient system that does not need to suffer hazards. This is the key piece. And this is where we can, as we think about a resiliency matrix or performance indicators in this space, not only are we looking at recovery time in a response and recovery phase, but also the ability to not even get impacted in the first place by, let's say, an extreme event. And again, as we think about building resiliency capacity, we think about the community's connectedness. Social capital is a huge indicator of resilience communities. Those communities with better social capital, deeper social capital, can weather shocks to the system much better than those that have loose connectivity or no connectivity. We need to better understand risk and vulnerability. There are a variety of risk assessment tools that are available and out there. I know that you've done some surveying of some of those. We're interested in harnessing and collecting more of them. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. Obviously, in our planning and procedures, we have good hazard mitigation planning regimes across our municipalities and regional planning commissions, but their quality and veracity vary drastically by the capacity of those communities and regions. Highly resourced regions have great plans. Low resource regions have nascent plans, maybe not many plans at all. So we need to standardize. And I know that you've been having conversations about regionalization and regionalizing planning and having regional planning with teeth and that kind of thing. And I personally think that that's a move that we need to be moving towards. And I think there's a way we can do it while still keeping agency at local communities. But we do need to do more regional planning. We need to do watershed scale planning and coordination. And obviously it takes resource availability and how we harness these things. A word about vulnerable populations and how important these would be to consider in any resiliency matrix. This is a community resiliency recovery curve that's fairly common in the literature that we've adapted a bit just to demonstrate that impacts and shocks to systems don't affect everyone equally. Those with high capacity before an event generally recover more quickly from a shock and potentially can even perform better after the shock, right? There are going to be some positives that come out of COVID, for example, for us. The ability to meet remotely will drop our carbon footprints, will help potentially increase the quality of life, allow us to spend more time with our families, for example, be more efficient with the use of our times. But then there also are people that start off vulnerable to begin with before an event and suffer shocks more deeply than the rest of us. And we've probably all seen the literature and seen examples of the K recovery, right? We see this in the higher education community, places like UVM. We're doing great. We have more students admitted and we're popping at the seams. Other higher education institutions across our state are not doing quite as well. Their admissions are lower. And how do we balance all of that out? Same thing with individual people, individual communities. And so I think the goal in all of this, and as you're developing and thinking about your pathways, is not only how do we raise a generic all boats, but how do we also target and single out the most vulnerable populations, the most vulnerable communities, to make sure that they receive what in the literature talks about the resiliency dividend. Judith Rogan wrote a book on that very topic. She's a former president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Rockefeller has done a lot of good work around community resiliency. And she wrote a book called Resiliency Dividend. And so how can we take shocks to the system, learn from them? That's always key. How do we learn as a system and build back better? I mean, this is where the Biden initiative, and I'm not going to get partisan with this, but I think the framing of that and the marketing on that is brilliant. And it talks about resiliency dividends. So there are ways to assess social vulnerability and when it comes to hazards. And as we think about a resiliency matrix, understanding that resilience and absorptive capacity is conditioned upon geospatial realities as well as demographic realities. So that's where the social ecological piece. So we can have a vulnerable part of the ecosystem, a floodplain. And then there are those that can recover fairly quickly from a flood, and there are those that cannot. And so we need to better understand that. One of the projects that came out of the IJC collaboration is some mapping and modeling around social vulnerability, particularly around Lake Champlain. I've had colleagues here at UVM that have done some of this kind of analysis for tributary flooding for the rest of the state that we can connect you to as well. But this is just an example for the city of Burlington. about how you can use vulnerability assessments around age populations, household characteristics, people with young children, elderly, those with disabilities, for example, tend to be more vulnerable to these challenges. And so we can begin to think about social vulnerability not only in a generic term, but in terms of, let's say in the case of flooding, in response to flooding, in the recovery from flooding, right? And so here are some indices that have been shown in the literature. Cutter's work et al., for example, on social vulnerability. There's a lot of good literature in this space, but it can talk about how quickly people can recover from hazardous events. And then thinking long-term about the mitigation standpoints. Not all mitigation responses affect people equally. And so we need to be thinking about that. And I would encourage you to continue thinking about that as you build out your pathway and recommendations. We can be thinking collectively if flood hazards, for example, is an event that we need to be concerned about. And I would argue that it's probably the kind of event that we should be mostly concerned about from a hazard standpoint for the state of Vermont. But I do think we need to be careful and concerned about drought, and then the ripple effects of drought, namely wildfires. We have a lot of forests with a lot of fuel in them. It would not take a lot on a long scale drought for that to become very vulnerable. And of course, the effects on drinking water supplies. But for flood hazards, for example, we can be thinking about aspects of the social ecological system, the social political economic system, and look at how individuals and institutions make decisions, process risk messaging, respond to them. Eric, I know you and your team think about this a lot when you're issuing flood hazards, for example, and how do you get the word out and get people to respond? And so we can begin to think about both flood mitigation as well as flood response and recovery. And I would just say that there are a variety of knowledge products that already exist. I mean, NOAA has early warning systems, but there are next generation early warning systems that are being developed for this very region that can be utilized and folded into both the near-term planning. So, the 5-day forecast, the 2-day forecast, the 3-hour forecast, when to put sandbags in, when to bug out and leave an area, versus the longer term flood hazards. And that's where that climate dashboard could come in handy and think about the pulses of a large scale extreme events and how they affect us. So how we think about this holistically, there are frameworks for this. This IJGC study is promoting this framework, and I think this is something that we can be building on. And then integrating data in resiliency metrics, both in terms of the social as well as the ecological systems, as well as the response and recovery phases. We've done some studies of flood hazard mitigation planning across the state, both in New York as well as in Vermont. Vermont, of course, has a very decentralized emergency management planning capacity. We have a very strong central state government with localities. In New York, they use their county governments for emergency response. And so we were looking particularly at the volume of flood hazard mitigation in particular regional and local plans. You'll see some heterogeneity. These are for lake adjacent towns. Some towns do not address it in their hazard mitigation plans. Others do quite extensively. But it's just a point of notion that we've got some data on the nature of our hazard mitigation plans, and there's some variability there. Just to add on to that, we've done some parsing of these plans based on the content of them, and that there are ways to look at structural, non-structural policy, preparedness, early warning, and education and outreach. And as I look at your pathways, the researcher in me wanted to then take a column and then start coding each of those based on some of these parameters to be able to note that I think in the best practices space, you want a nice distribution of responses across all of these different areas. And some places do them better than others. Vermont statewide planning has a nice balance to it. as compared to New York's. New York State's got a very instrumental, this bridge needs to be replaced. We have much more of a broader policy framework that I think holistically works. Now it just needs to be coupled with regional and local plans. So I know that the focus of this committee is on resilient rural communities. And just to recognize that I think rural communities have not gotten the love and attention that they need to. There's often an urban-rural divide. A lot of our urban solutions are tailored to rural communities. You see this in the example in the digital economy. How do you take what's happening in Burlington and export it to smaller towns? I'm not saying that's not a good idea. I think we need to do that. But rural communities have their own identities and dimensions. And I think just to recognize that our rural communities have not gotten as much attention as our urban centers. And so, these are some value propositions. So again, I'll have this for you. If you're going to be writing a report, you need a preamble just to underscore the value proposition of your subcommittee. There's some language here for you. The last bit of information I'd like to share is on the results of an economic resiliency set of roundtables that we did in late winter. We had 75 people that were experts in the workforce development, economic development, social services, BIPOC community advocacy organizations, public financing groups, and asked them to help us define what success looks like and how can we help Vermonters in rural communities, particularly, do well in a post-pandemic world. Now, you would say that this is not necessarily as directly related to climate change, but I would argue that it very much is, right? So the gist of the report, and we're going to release this report next week, and we'll be happy to share copies with you, is based on a very simple architecture of challenges and opportunities, right? And so the challenges that we surfaced, these were 75, the results of 8 roundtables, 75 people across a wider spectrum. And I've highlighted some that are particularly relevant, I think, when we think about rural resiliency. Lack of and or aging infrastructure for town centers that limit capacities for sustained growth, right? If we're looking at climate change and the influx of people that will likely move here because of climate change, how do we grow our town centers and not promote sprawl? One of the things that these experts, and again, these are not, we did our RPCs in the mix on this, but they weren't all zoning administrators, for example. They raised the issue about aging infrastructure or non-infrastructure of downtown centers. So, and it's not only, it's water infrastructure, obviously, it's our transportation infrastructure. It's also, I think, the other kind of infrastructure, other kinds of amenities, as we think about transitions to more remote work, for example. It was widely recognized that the threatened waterways and landscapes compromise one of our greatest virtues, what attracts people, things that people want to live here, why we want to live here. And so the ecological threats that climate change poses is also an economic threat. And I don't need to say that to you, you know that, but there are ways that we can quantify that and make that case strongly. Also in terms of transportation infrastructure and how we grow more public infrastructure, transportation infrastructure that balances out ecological need with social need and make that affordable. The high cost of energy is a detriment to our economy. I know you've been thinking about this in terms of carbon and reducing our carbon footprint. There are economic consequences to that I think actually couple together in a very good argument for reducing and increasing renewables, particularly if they can reduce the costs to Vermonters to be able to heat their homes, et cetera. And the last thing I want to point out in the challenges space is that there are gaps in coordination that are necessary and we need to fill. The roundtable also surfaced some key opportunities. Among those that I want to highlight is to promote and sustain workforce while maintaining thriving town centers. So
Chris, I'm just aware of the time, so I just want to be aware of the time as you're doing your good
okay.
stuff.
Okay, I'll wrap up. We want to be able to leverage quality of life. Obviously, investment of broadband, housing, and transportation is critical. And then this last piece in terms of collective action, collective impact, and how do we organize for that? So I just want to leave you with this notion around collective impact. And those of you who are familiar with the Farm to Plate network uses this framework. The Energy Action Network has used this kind of framework. And so we are making these recommendations around communication hubs, common agendas, shared metrics, robust infrastructure development, and reinforcing activities. And I would say that as you're looking at your pathway number 1, this is a meta solution for pathway 1. And I would encourage you to think about how to recommend this kind of framework. And shared metrics is really, I think, aiding in your implementation of your pathway 2. As we think about the development of resiliency indices, there are a variety of frameworks to be drawing from. One is the Sustainable Development Goals. I've got a grad student that's going to be working on a voluntary assessment of those. There is the progress indicators that we've got work done. The Gun Institute has shepherded those. There is an example from Nebraska. They have a thriving indices. It's not climate change focused, but it's more broad, but it's an interesting framework that leverages partnerships. And then of course there's a variety of literature that looks at how to develop metrics and use those metrics around economic, social, and environmental capital. And so we're interested in collecting data and harnessing the data in all of these areas that can then be used to create guidance for investment strategies in a lot of the pathways and the sub-pathways that you're going to be recommending. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, Chris, thanks so much. I don't know if folks have questions for right now for Chris.
Yeah, I've got a question, if there's time.
Yep, go for it.
So Chris Cochran, I'm the Director of Community Planning and Revitalization. I work at the Agency of Commerce. When we're thinking about our infrastructure, it's all interconnected. And I know you've thought a lot about kind of what rural Vermont means. I've really struggled with how do you separate that out? How do you apply a rural lens to something that is all interconnected and matters to everybody? The interconnectedness of it matters. How do you separate that out? I guess I didn't phrase that question well, but I just struggle with like, how do we give a rural focus to some of the work we're doing, given it's so broad. I
know, it's a big challenge. I mean, one of the things that we framed in the roundtables was we really were intentional about framing this as community economic development. And to that effect, having social service providers and those with expertise in certain infrastructure areas was so critical. And that's where I think we need indices and we need metrics that compare and contrast housing stock with ecological valuation, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some really interesting ways to visualize those trade-offs to be able to maximize and create some optimization across that. So I think the first thing to do is to not silo these issues, but to look at them as integrated wholes. And then to note that we're getting more and more sophisticated with our data analytics capacity to mix metrics to be able to accentuate, to create sort of a meta indices that can maximize the effectiveness of these coupled systems. So it's a sticky problem, but I do think that if we are thinking about doing some sort of indices, it would be a multi-scalar and multi-dimensional one that would work with stakeholders to then derive products that would have real value for decision-making. So, and I think that's what our rural communities need, right? They can probably list off all the top things they need, but then how they get coupled is really kind of the critical question, I think, for the long haul. It's a great point.
Any other questions for Chris Kaliba right now?
I have a question just as it relates to that last point, Chris. As you probably know, we're also charged with developing a municipal vulnerability index. and vulnerability is different than resilience, but they are connected. And so I'm wondering, you know, we at some point need to get back to that work once we have integrated the work for the climate action plan.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, you know, that's a powerful tool for decision making.
Yeah.
Is that something that we could reach out and you would be interested in working with us on?
Yeah, sure. And that that's why I show those maps of Burlington, that you can overlay census tract data on different vulnerabilities. And then you can also overlay in terms of jobs availability. I mean, there are a variety of layers that can be put to that. And so, yeah, I think at UVM, you know, the spatial analysis lab, there's a lot of GPS layers that can be put on. You can use heat maps, assessments.
And I think that's actually part of our challenge is, you know, there's a good tool to use to demonstrate the results of that data, but it's really making a determination of what equals vulnerability in Vermont municipalities. And I think that's what we could probably use some help on, you know, determining what those data sets are. Yep. To you know, really get a good picture of vulnerability in Vermont.
I think that's, yes, we'd be happy to work with you on that for sure.
Chris, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Very, very helpful. And we're going to dive our next topic, but thanks so much.
Okay. Thank you all for the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Chris.
Okay, Chris 2. We're going to do, we want kind of feedback from the Climate Council on kind of the good work you guys did on kind of goals and vision. So Chris, I think I'm going to turn this over to you and maybe Marion.
Great, thank you so much. First, I just want to thank Bronwyn and Marion for helping pull all this together, and the folks who helped them on the committee putting together these kind of broad, high-level goals. If I had to sum up, you know, the feedback that we got from the Climate Council, they were not high level. They tended to be very narrow and very focused. So I will share this, and I'm interested in if other people feel the same way, but they tended to be more kind of granular and more detailed in their focus. I think they all made good points, but whether they should actually reshape our goals at this point is a question I have. And maybe I'll just leave it there. The response to the vision, I really, as far as Marion, chime in if everybody didn't seem to have any concerns about that. I think it was a favorable response.
Yeah, I don't have my notes because I'm sharing my screen. I don't have my notes up, but I don't believe there's any feedback. But on the point you just made, I think something to think about as we go through and look at the goals and then think about the feedback that we received. I agree, some of it was very specific, but I actually think it may help to highlight actions that may be needed or strategies that may be needed. So, or metrics that we can start thinking about for tracking these goals. So you're right. I don't think there will be so much massaging of many of the goals, but I do think as the next item on the agenda, start to think about how do we actually collect and consolidate our strategies and actions under pathways. I think some of this feedback, that's, I think, what folks were getting at with a lot of it.
Right.
So just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, you're channeling Bronwyn. Bronwyn basically said, you know, let's talk about this feedback, and then when we get down to our specific actions, make sure that we're cross-tabbing them and making sure that everything's being addressed.
Jane, did you want to make a quick point?
Oh, I'm off mute already. I just wanted to highlight that Marion took her own notes, but also CBI did a really great job, and I do have open the minutes from the meeting, and if you wanted me to just bullet through some of the specific comments that were reflected in the minutes, if that's helpful, Chris, while you're up, while Marion's presenting, I'd be happy to share.
And I took the minutes and the notes that I took and sent them all to Chris, so he should have had those.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah,
and then reflective, the only other was one counselor who I'm curious if you've heard from, but she, Leslie Ann, was interested in sending you feedback also, but probably haven't seen anything, I would imagine.
Yeah.
Nope, we got it. I got it earlier today.
Oh, great.
Yeah, and I think Leslie Ann made some good points, but again, I think they're more granular and more, you know, strategy and action level that we'll be able to address. So Feedback on this, I think it was mostly Chris Campany, was talking about municipal recovery. I'm a little lost. I didn't really understand his point. So Marion, I don't know, this is more your world than mine. So I don't know if you want to jump in.
I could also probably jump in.
Go for it, Erica.
Yeah, or if you even want to read his comment, it might help provide some context for folks.
I don't have his comment.
Oh, I think I sent you the email. I should have it in there.
Erica, though, maybe go ahead if you have a.
So, yeah, I think what he was getting at is that there's a service gap or in recovery for individuals. So we handle public infrastructure recovery to disasters really well through like damage reporting and making sure that reimbursement is had for, especially for publicly funded public infrastructure. On the individual side, Vermont, in our rural nature, we do have a gap, especially because it takes a lot of damage to be able to get a disaster declaration that covers individual private property owner damages. We're so spread out that we don't have centers where a lot of people have homes that were destroyed or sustained major damage, which is what we have to show for FEMA to justify a declaration for support for them. So what he's pointing out is that there's a whole system that's needed to be enhanced for post-disaster recovery for individuals that not only matches up resources for their unmet needs, but also provides specifically financial support for them. It actually gets to Chris Kaliba's point with the K recovery chart, where people that start out at kind of a disadvantaged place anyway, when they're impacted by a disaster, they should not be starting at even below, they shouldn't be ending below where they began. If anything, we would want to hopefully utilize that as an opportunity to lift them up and give them greater opportunity to succeed in the future, and that we just don't have that. And it becomes like a self-defeating cycle when disasters are impacting the same populations of people over and over and over again. So that was his point, and I think we can address that in some of the actions, because I mean, I completely agree with him.
Definitely an action level issue that we respond to.
Ben, do you have a quick comment?
Yes, I would like to see what Chris sent on this. I've been going back and forth with Chris quite a lot, and with Jason Goslin, who's the State Individual Assistance Officer, as we deal with this in real time related to the July 29th and 30th flooding and how we respond. And I'm hopeful that Chris and I are going to have a specific recommendation to put forward related to this, and funding for disaster case management for individuals through support of the regional planning commissions. And we want to get that Catherine involved with that as well. But I think we're really trying to boil down Chris's comments to something that's actionable for consideration.
Yeah, and I have it in front of me. I can read. He suggested that by 2025, Vermont has a comprehensive individual household needs response and long-term recovery framework in place. He said the one for public infrastructure is already quite strong. He noted the key gap was unevenness and general absence of well-organized local recovery framework, not emergency response. This is a recovery assistance issue after disaster. So, yeah. And I can also share all these comments after if that's helpful.
Great. Yeah, we are working on that in response to the recent disaster.
Great. Chris, want to keep moving on there?
Yeah, so we can go to the next slide unless there's other thoughts on this. If I recall, the only comment we got back from this was from Liz Miller at Green Mountain Power, and hers was, basically, we don't need to plan to do this. We need to, take action now, and we need to, fund these opportunities. I agree, absolutely, if we know where to put the money. But I think that again, in my mind, falls into an action and something we can consider when we roll all these things up.
Chris, I've gotten some feedback on this one as well, and actually it wasn't Liz. Is just more all the things that we're already doing. Like for instance, Joe's organization is doing resiliency work all over the state of Vermont. GMP is, VEC is, and I just think some people read this as limiting and not including any of that. So I do think we should think about some language that makes sure people knows that there's already things happening and this isn't limiting at all. I quickly had a conversation with Anne when we were canceling a meeting earlier today about this too, and she had some thoughts on it, but I do think this might be worth adding some language to.
You
Any other
have,
comments?
go ahead, Pat.
No, very good.
I was just going to ask, Mike, if you had a suggestion either through discussions with Anne or others, would it be generally adding language to all three of the goals, or is there a specific one that folks felt like was limiting?
For me, I think the 2025 goal probably needed to be updated to include more of what's already happening and encouraging and enhancing. I don't know if we can come up with, do this much by then. But I just think what I've heard from 2 or 3 people is it sounds like it's going to take until 2025 for us to decide what to do. And in reality, we're already doing a bunch of things. So I haven't had time to sit down and recommend language. Anne, I don't know if you have any thoughts here.
Yeah, if I may, I don't think we meant or anyone meant for the 2025 goal to preclude action that's happening or that should happen. But just to, make it clear that that's not the case. I was just thinking we could add the words design, evaluation, and construction after planning. So it would read, blah, 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 and are incorporated into planning, design, evaluation, and construction of.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I agree that we're done with all the planning that we need to do. I think we're sort of in a transition where we've done some, and we are doing some, like we speaking for construction, transportation, where we are doing some, being proactive about addressing vulnerabilities. But I think we need to do more. I think we need to do more of it. Maybe, I'd like to see more dedicated funding sources to do that, rather than just waiting for a disaster and getting hazard mitigation money for that.
You and me both.
Yeah.
All right, anything else?
We raise that point. We raise that point pretty often, that especially like we have, as a result of the COVID disaster declaration and the ARPA money, we have $38 million over the next 2 years to spend on hazard mitigation funding. But when the ARPA money dries up, we no longer have a state-sourced hazard mitigation program, nor do we have a way to match, provide matching funding for projects that are federally funded. So I think that's an important piece here.
Yeah. Not that we don't appreciate the hazard mitigation money, but money that's whatever that we can be proactive with would be great.
All right. Good.
I've been listening into a lot of these the FEMA BRIC program. I guess there's another round, $5 billion statewide. This is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program. It seems like there's going to be a lot of money on the table. And, I know I've worked with Stephanie Smith at Vermont Emergency Management on looking at some potential proposals, but that would need to be acted on quickly, but it could be a potential opportunity for a lot of these projects in the near term. But it does seem that like the benefit cost analysis is a big challenge for folks to complete. And it seemed like and we've talked about this, like human resources, human capital for communities. It seems like that is potentially needed at the state level too, additional capacity to assist communities in pursuing some of this funding where a private partner like Green Mountain Power could bring in the match that's required in that case. But we need someone to really just shepherd all that along and put the pieces together and do the hard work.
Thanks. Chris, go ahead and keep moving if we can.
Okay, yeah, let's go into I'm sure Stephanie Smith would love to lead that charge. Next slide, if we can. This one was unfinished, but the group is reconvening, I believe, next week to work on this one. The one feedback we got was from Abby Course. She's a farmer in Southern Vermont, I believe. And she was just worried about, I think the comment she made was just about the loss of schools and how that affects communities. And then also thinking about the additional transportation and GHGs related when a school closes, that kids and everybody needs to drive farther. I think this is going to be a really important one for us to work on. I know Representative Sibilia, this is hers, and we'll stay tuned on this, and we'll continue to work at this, and we'll share this back with the group once we have the goals set out. Next slide. This was our smart growth goals. We had some questions from I think Rich Cowart about how do we consider this in the terms of how we have the environment, I mean, we have the development we have now, and how do we measure this change over time as we build more housing or as we do more development. And there was some discussion around how do we measure this over time. I'm trying to recall. Marion, do you remember anything else?
Yeah, I mean, he was sort of asking about how do we also know when we're making an impact on those greenhouse gas emissions, when we're considering smart growth strategies. So it was a nice tee up to talk about the plan for some smart growth study in the future. Yeah.
So we will continue to work on that, but yes, we do need to study and measure. So it was good to hear that. Next slide, just to keep it moving.
Well, I think, do we want to talk a little bit about 2030? So this was the one, there was quite a few comments about no new development or redevelopment when feasible in the river corridor. That was, I think, the one that received the most comments. And I also reached out to someone in the A&R Rivers program, as we talked about at our last meeting, to get specific feedback on that wording, ensuring that we're using the appropriate terminology. So I initially reached out to Rob Evans, but he was out last week. So I reached out to John Broker Campbell. He said it sounds a bit generic, but he would encourage to work with language similar that basically says avoid new development in undeveloped floodplains and river corridors. He says there tends to be strong pushback from statements such as no new development, and they recognize that many village and municipalities located within the floodplain are going to need to remain there. And then I think just from the meeting, again, there was quite a bit of feedback from folks, both in the chat and verbally, about defining what when feasible means. And then I think, some question about the sort of the statement of no new development.
Yeah, and thank you for reminding me that I totally missed that. And then I guess the question I have, should it be 2020, 2030, or should we move that up? Should we put more generic language about avoiding hazardous development in 2025?
Further thoughts on this for now?
No, but it's nice to hear that all the questions were on the same things we struggled with as we were talking about these, right?
I wonder if there's, instead of saying, no new development, even when feasible, it's maybe more that there's an assessment process or some sort of regulatory process that's in place to assess new development and its risk, based on the type of development. Certainly like residential development in a special flood hazard area or the flood corridor is more problematic than other types of development.
And to me, something like that is an action.
Yeah.
All right. Before we move on, any last thoughts here?
So I put the suggestion on the language from the Rivers program, if we want to tease out that a bit, or just bring that back for further discussion. But this is really, instead of saying no new development, it's saying avoid new development in undeveloped areas, undeveloped floodplains and river corridors.
Jane, do you have a quick comment?
Well, yeah, I was really shocked that they would say in undeveloped floodplains and river corridors. Like it feels like avoid new development in floodplains and river corridors. It sounds much stronger to me. So was there a rationale for putting undeveloped?
Yeah, his email said tends to be strong pushback from statements such as no new development. They recognize many villages and municipalities are located within floodplains and river corridors, and they will remain there.
Yeah, that's why we added
Areas
when
that remain
feasible.
largely undeveloped. Yep.
And is the
I
question?
feel like we should I would want to move to somehow changing that word. I mean,
Right.
maybe it's not black and white, but I wouldn't just say, if you've developed it, keep going.
Right. I don't know whether also you want to be in the affirmative, which is part of the problem, because no new development sounds like a ban. But yeah, new development and redevelopment occurs outside the river corridor or something like that. Sometimes stating in the affirmative that helps with the phrasing. Jens and then Joe.
I just want to remind us that, you know, the scale of the problem and the more we're watering down solutions, I think the less effective they become. So I would really encourage us to do the strongest language that we all feel comfortable with.
Joe.
Yeah, sorry if the ship's already sailed, but on the language for the pathway, you know, just the focus on changing just land use policies, you know, maybe that's meant to be really broad, but I just, you know, is that enough? Is it really just about the policies, or is it about something else? And maybe the policies lead to everything else, but that just seems, we can change all the policies we want in the world and still nothing happens. So, right, because you've done a lot of work. We've done a lot of work with land use policies in Vermont over many years, and we're still struggling. So don't know how to say that the right way, whether it's enhance what we have now or whatever, but or implement the policies that we have, change or implement the policies that we have, or better implement them.
Bronwyn.
To continue on this pathway of pointing out how difficult I think this particular pathway is, both in the language of the pathway, but then also coming up with goals. I mean, it still kind of floats back to the presentation we just heard on what does it mean to be resilient? What is our goal in terms of resilience? And I think there was some other feedback from Leslie Ann around keeping our understanding of what it means to be resilient and what are the hazards to be more broad beyond flood and flood resilience. Although I will say that part of the reason flood building in flood prone areas is in the goal statement is because that is one that we can really kind of wrap our heads around at this point in time. But just to say that I think from the feedback I'm hearing, it seems like really part of our goal has to be to understand and to come up with some group of metrics around what does it mean to be resilient and how do we weigh these decisions around resiliency? Is it better to make existing building in a flood prone area more resilient to flooding, or is it better to start fresh somewhere else? And I think those are the kind of decisions we have to make, and it's really difficult to translate those into specific goals. So no answers there, but just to flag that I think this is feedback we keep hearing, that what does it mean to be resilient and how do we translate that into measurable goals that we can stand behind in sort of every decision-making instance.
Let's do this. Let's maybe Chris can go. I think maybe, is there one more pathway, Chris? I can't remember, I think.
Yeah, there's just one more, and we didn't get a lot of comments on that.
And then we should talk about next steps, given the comments today. So
Do you want me to go to the next one?
yeah, let's go to the next one and then
Yeah, I don't think we got any on this.
Yeah, Sue Minter wanted to flag the importance of folks living in mobile home parks are usually at a high degree of flood risk. So her recommendation was to make sure that we had a plan to address that. To me, that was more of an actionable step, and the state has thought and considered this to a great degree. Usually it's just been a lack of money and an ability to really do something to make that situation better. Erica, you had also commented on this too, about the flood, mobile home parks in the floodplain.
I can't remember what it was.
Okay.
You know, and she also had a comment about flood mapping
Uh-huh.
and the fact that the federal flood mapping really kind of puts us at a disadvantage because it doesn't accurately reflect the true flood risk in Vermont because the maps are so antiquated. And therefore in the state, we use a more expanded version that is developed by ANR.
So in terms of, Chris, next steps, we got some good feedback today. You have feedback from the council. What are the next steps for these two?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I really want to start, I guess it's the next steps that we're going to do is we're going to start populating these with our strategies with actions, and then, crosswalking those with the feedback we got. I think once we see them all together, I think there will be some obvious instances where we're going to want to refine and modify our language. But I'd like to do that first before we start tweaking this overall language. And then we still need to get those other, I think it was a pathway 3 about schools, and get that in there too. And I don't know, Mary, Jane, what's our timeline? Do we have to get this done next week? Do we have some time to cogitate on these, or does these have to be done?
Well, as it reflects how you'll move forward prioritizing your strategies and actions, that will come in the next few weeks. So I don't think it has to be done tomorrow, but I think as it would inform directionally how you prioritize your work, I think it would be great to have them refined by the middle of September, because the goal for us is to start to conceptually draw out prioritization with the steering committee on September 7th. And then hopefully come to consensus with the full council on the 14th.
We can do that.
And that will speak to your measurable goals.
So we'll definitely want to maybe have a revisit of these next week in our meeting.
Yes, and so we'll work on them some more and then hopefully present a more refined version of this based on the feedback we heard today.
Great. All right. Anything else? Thanks, Chris, so much. Anything else on that before we move to a little bit of work planning in our massive spreadsheet and so on and so forth?
I can't wait to see that massive spreadsheet.
Looked at it already.
Bring your binoculars. Good. So, Chris, thanks a lot. So next thing we want to move into a little bit of Marion doing a really good job of trying to amass all the various kind of task group strategies and actions into a master document. Now, I think the question is, we're not going to sort through this at this level of detail today, but we want to kind of show it to you just to give you a sense of an overview of what it is. Don't panic. And then what we want to do is talk about like how we move from here to continue to refine and hone your strategies and actions in order to get a presentation, essentially the Vermont Climate Council, the end of September. Marion and Jane can give you the dates so that you feel like you have got vetted, thoughtful, prioritized strategies. Again, we don't have all those actions yet that fall within your good pathways and goals you've been developing. So Marion, maybe say a little bit about the spreadsheet, how you assembled it, what it does, and then we can talk about where we go from here.
Sure. And I sent it out in advance in the hopes that if you did panic, you did it alone by yourselves off camera. And now I can pull it up. So give me a second here. And as Pat said, we're not going to walk through this together. I just want to show you all, just orient you to this, and then we'll talk about the best way to break this up into manageable tasks among the subcommittee and move forward. So shout out to Bronwyn for this template. She used it for something ACCD put together and I thought it was great. So I repurposed it for all of ours. What I did is Jens helped me pull all of the pathways and strategies and associated strategies and other actions that we had worked on a couple months ago that was in the Miro site. If you all recall that meeting, we were sort of zooming in and zooming out on a virtual whiteboard. All of the work that you all did in your task groups was to pull together some set of pathways, and then we consolidated those into 5 that we have, but then strategies underneath them, because you all did a lot of really great thinking about those. I pulled all of those into one place because what we need to start doing is working through those in some strategic way to figure out where's their overlap, where are there strategies that perhaps we don't need to keep in right now, where are there strategies that are actually actions that need to fit under certain strategies. So we really need to do some work in sort of cleaning this and figuring out where there's overlap, perhaps where there's broader themes that we haven't addressed, thinking perhaps about some of the stuff that Chris Kaliba presented on, so that we're ready for a presentation to the Climate Council. And I just want to Pat, something you said about we will need actions for the presentation. So it's not just strategies. It will be actions as well. It's not going to be all of the actions because there's no way we could present all of them, but it will also be actions to present to the Climate Council.
And Mayor, are you anticipating, this actually came up this morning in the ag meeting too. Are you expecting actions as just samples underneath some strategies? Or are you actually looking for a comprehensive list of actions?
Jane, do you want to answer that? I know it's tied to the conversation we had this morning.
Yeah, so our expectation now in working with the council is that there's going to be a lot of information coming up in the course of the next few months, and thinking about how we deliver what will likely be a lot of action for them to digest. We're envisioning a similar package with respect to what you did in July, but this time identifying all your strategies and pulling up the handful of actions that illuminate those strategies. Mind you, that may be them all if you are able to whittle enough, but I imagine that the presentation will be a snapshot and will give guidance on how to articulate which ones to elevate for consumption in a presentation. That said, what it means for work planning though is that we are anticipating that the week prior to the actual presentation, that there will be a need to send out a full suite in a template of all your actions so that the council can come prepared to having reviewed them preliminary as homework. And that way, if they don't see the one that was giving them pause, they can ask a question. But our hope is to be able to do better jobs with informing counselors in between meetings so they can advance things at the meeting and not say, oh, I need more time, let's push it to the next council meeting. We're trying to really set the expectation at the September 14th meeting about what counselors will have to come prepared to do. So yeah, this is not the only time you will present actions. It's intended to be a preliminary suite but a comprehensive one that you'll have another shot at presenting further fleshed out with implementation components a month later in the schedule.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. So, Mary, anything else in orientation to the spreadsheet itself?
Yep. So let me just walk through what it looks like to orient you to it, and then I can pull it down and we can just talk about work planning. You'll see the first tab of the spreadsheet has the full list of all of your pathways, and then what I pulled from the Miro in terms of strategies, and some of them had actions underneath. You'll see in some of the pathways, it's really just a long list of strategies, which is going to take some work to clean up and figure out. A reminder sort of about strategies and actions. Strategies are slightly the broader look at a set of actions that will help us reach, part of the pathway. The action is really what's the specific policy, program, funding source, et cetera, that you need to reach that specific strategy. So action is getting really specific, and then the strategy is at that higher level. So everything is in the full list, and then you'll see there are tabs for each of the pathways. It's the same thing that's on the full list. I just found it sometimes easier if you just want to look at, pathway one. It's the same thing just on one sheet if you want to play around with it. So just to orient you, so the sort of gray and black row at the top has your pathway language here, and then the goals associated with those pathways in the subsequent cells. And then if there were strategies and actions associated with each other, the strategies in green and the actions are all underneath. So you'll see that I've started to identify some where I think they may be strategies instead, or there may be some overlap. So if you look at the sheet, you may see some comments from me already about some of that. So if you just continue to scroll down, some of the stuff we need to think about, there's different formatting for how we're wording the action. So all of this is things we'll have to think about how we consolidate and ensure that we have one package that speaks to all the work the subcommittee has done. And so here's pathway 2 and so on and so forth. So I won't go any further than that. I'll let you all explore it. This is generally what it is. You'll see here, there's a whole bunch of strategies under this particular pathway, and we don't have any actions associated with these yet. So that's work we'll have to do. But if folks have questions on this, we can do that. If not, I can take it down and we can just talk about work planning.
Erica, then Bronwyn.
Are you looking for strategies and actions for the pathway more broadly, or you want us to put them underneath like 3 sets for the 2025 goal, 2030 goal? Okay, so it's just more broadly for the pathway itself. Okay.
Yeah, we're not, the goals, you don't have to, I mean, the goals might be helpful when you think about actions, but you don't need to tie strategies and actions to specific goals. The goals we're sort of using as benchmarks, but really focus on the pathway itself. The goals can just help you frame that up.
Thank you.
Bronwyn.
Just a reminder on this, where we were at with strategies. So this list of strategies, there's a lot more in here than the last time we presented the pathways and strategies publicly. Was that because the last presentation was just a sampling of strategies? And so this is the full list of strategies that this group has come up with and deliberated.
I believe so.
Not deliberated yet, but
yeah,
this is the full list. Okay.
And others can correct me on that, but I'm fairly, yeah, this is the full list that we have from that Miro site. If it needs to be refined further, if we did that and it's captured somewhere, then I can adjust this and send it back out. But this, I think, was the latest version. But Erica.
Yeah, I think it was. I think if I'm recalling correctly, there was. I think I got the. There was some additional information from Mike's and Ann's group around electrical infrastructure and communications infrastructure, and I'll want you guys to just double check that stuff is in there in the spreadsheet. But otherwise, I don't. And I think I got all of the ACCD inputs into the Miro board. I think the thing to note here is that these are initial, so these are really subject to your revision and prioritization.
So I think
and if there's something missing that needs to be added, you as a group should do that.
So the question for you all is kind of where to from here. So Marion's going to have done the initial job of organizing. The group might want to look for themes that are or strategy and actions that are redundant, just to fold those in. But then I think it's the question of like, what other vetting to organize that matrix do we need? And then we actually need to think about where are you going to prioritize or focus your recommendations.
And if I can throw a suggestion out, but we don't have to do it this way, is it may be helpful to sort of, if you recall, we used to be grouped in task groups with small groups meeting outside of the steering committee meetings. Perhaps we want to regroup as pathway groups, and those smaller groups start working through the strategies and actions to figure out where's their overlap, where's it two, actions phrased different ways, make sure you're clearing that out. I think we all agree we don't want to do it in a big group like this. So either, one person takes it or small groups take it for the pathways, but we could also use a different approach. That's just one way to think about it.
Jane, and then Mike.
I like the idea. Whoops, sorry. Oh, Jane, then Mike. Sorry, go ahead, Jane.
I was actually just going to build upon what Marion suggested, which I think is a great first step. And then I think what will need to happen, and what Pat can reflect on that he helped facilitate this morning, is for those task leads, because you'll have to bucket and pair up under each pathway and identify actions, but then there's going to be tearing down, or that check of understanding where the strategies are across pathways, because there's going to be overlap across. So it feels like if you could organize by pathway and then have the leads of each pathway come together and bucket it again before you spend too much time diving into action development further, I think that would be really great.
So
Marion, to that question, how much did you, Mike, go ahead. Mike, you go first and I'll go.
I was just along the same line. Ann, Chad, and I have energy covered pretty well in the infrastructure, but we're missing transportation. We're missing some other infrastructure that I thought if we did do it by pathway, it might be a little more encompassing. So was just agreeing with that thought.
So what we might do, I know the group this morning wanted to take a similar kind of matrix and clean it up to make sure there's no redundancies, things are categorized in the right place, and to look across the pathways to see what is similar or linked or the like, and then eliminate any redundancy. So that is, and it's a kind of tedium work. It's important. So I don't know whether that's something you want to task a staff person to do, or a small group wants to do that. And I think kind of that is the first order of business.
Yeah, and just to preview, I didn't go through it much looking for redundancy, but found a strategy under one pathway that was a suggested pathway under another pathway. So it was just saying that there is some redundancy, but what I was doing for that when I was compiling ag and ecosystems, you almost have to sort of control F and find where they've talked about, workforce engagement and see where that shows up in multiple places, because it is such a big list. There's no way you can keep it all in your head, but we don't want to, repeat the same action over and over again. So just a preview of what that work looks like. And I'm happy to help in whatever way the group decides.
I'm not sure that actions have to just fall under one strategy, or even strategies have to fall under one pathway. I know it might be hard to read because, it gets redundant, but I mean, I think the fact if an action addresses several pathways or strategies, that's kind of says something about that action.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think something we've talked about in terms of how that's actually displayed in the climate action plan is, perhaps there's a strategy that is really primary under a specific pathway, but it has similar co-benefits under other pathways. We'll want a way to sort of mark that so that we say, okay, well, this pathway really works under this specific, or this strategy is really key under this specific pathway. I'm getting my words jumbled. Or something about a statewide planning office may be relevant to multiple pathways, but we may just want to explain that once, and then there will be, and that's what we could perhaps do to this spreadsheet to build it out, is to say, okay, it's key here, and then there are co-benefits in these other pathways, and let's put a check mark where those other ones are, so that we're not duplicating it and sort of assigning, eventual implementation work to multiple people. We have it once, and then we can note where else it's a needed action.
So, I mean, I think in terms of just kind of doing the organizing part of the spreadsheet one step further, is that something you are, if, again, I don't know if Marion, you have time or not, but if you just want Marion to do, some other small group of people want to do that.
Do we want to kind of raise hands based on pathways right now, just to give us a start on pathway groups?
And I can pull up the pathway slide just so folks remember what they all are.
And so again, we would be moving right from task groups to pathways. So maybe they may be different configurations of people. We've got 5.
Oops, sorry.
The other question too is if we form these again, I think I just want to, on the organizing part of the matrix, I guess I'm wondering, Marion, whether you can do a little bit more work on that as described. And then we identify the pathway groups, figure out who's volunteering, and they would continue to do the organizing and then begin to kind of maybe make sense, even begin to think about prioritization or the like.
Sure, if you all want to define what you mean by organizing, I don't want to start deleting text because this is work that you all put together. So if you just mean adding, columns in the spreadsheet that talk about those co-benefits, I guess, can you explain a bit more, Pat?
Yeah, I think what the last group talked about was just to talk about, like, make sure everything's assigned to the right pathway. If there may be like essentially the same action and or strategies that appear in multiple pathways. So look for those and identify if they're essentially redundant. Doesn't mean they shouldn't be, but do that. The other thing they did, which I don't know you guys want to do, is they literally did a different matrix, which is a little complicated, and took all of the strategies and actions and then linked up where they showed up in a primary pathway and where they were connected to one or more secondary pathways. So you could kind of see where those things appeared across pathways as opposed to just within a bucket. That was a fair amount of work.
Maybe we can do that deconfliction when we come back together.
Yes. Yes.
So that way we can asterisk the ones that, each of the groups, because organically, if each of the groups identifies a certain action or strategy, and then even when we come back together as a larger group for presentation and deconfliction, you may find that, it's come up, it was like on the edge in your group, and you actually do want to elevate it. So when we come back, these will still be draft, and we'll still be ruminating on which one should be prioritized as a group.
So why don't you want to do, Erica, do you want to just see if we have volunteers for each of these 5, see who we have, and then we'll kind of see where we go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So number 1, who would be a few folks who would be willing to kind of further work on that?
So I'm gonna, sorry, Chris, there's a couple of people that are not here that should be on this group.
Catherine should do that.
Yeah.
Possibly David Snedeker.
The one should be Catherine, David Snedeker. Did I just see a hand up? Ben, did I see your hand up?
Ben should be on this
And right now, hand raising, I think, is saying I'm volunteering, right? So I want to make sure. Okay.
Correct.
So I have Ben and Jens on as well for one. And Marion, are you capturing these? And Chris too. Are you capturing these names, Marion?
I'm not, because I have my computer screen
Okay.
open. So if somebody else can, that would be great.
Erica, can you get those okay? Do you want me to? Do you got them?
I got it. Catherine, David, Chris.
Chris, Ben for staff, and Jens for staff. So.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Got it.
Next one is resilience, essentially infrastructure. So 2. Raise your hand, Chad. Good. Joe.
I'm trying to raise my hand.
Mike, I was waiting, Mike, for you to volunteer. Mike.
It's under reactions.
Thank you.
And Ann's on there as well. And Chris, you want to be on there too?
I don't, but yeah, I gotta be on this one.
Whoops, that's clap.
That's okay. That's close enough. We'll go with that. Now he's got 2. Now you got 2 going on.
Give yourself a hand, Mike.
Excellent. Oh, Jane.
Can I raise my hand to raise Stephanie's hand?
Yeah, sure.
Definitely. Jane, what was your?
I just want everybody, all of a sudden I was seeing a lot of hands, but just to make sure you don't want quorum likely for these pathway groups. So just make sure however official subcommittee members are on them, that you that way it's just easy to share documents.
What's
quorum?
It's 5, right?
Okay, so we need 4 or less, correct, Jane? Staff are
And
fine.
except for staff are fine, yeah.
Okay, all
Great.
Erica, you'll check that and just make sure we're not over. Okay. Let's go to the fossil fuel reduction. And if folks want to take down their hands now, just so you're not volunteering for multiple things, that would be good. Unless you want to multiple. Okay, thank you. So for fossil fuel reduction, Anne?
I think Dave Snedeker
I'm
has
already
been helping
here.
with this one, right?
Yeah, isn't this the one that Dave and Chad and I are supposed to be working on? We're already delinquent and we have a meeting next week.
Yeah, and you folks had
Or we
developed.
don't have one yet, but we will. Thanks to Marion.
Public poke, Chad. Let me know when you're available.
Yeah, okay.
So Ann, David, Chad.
So that's for goal setting, which is different. If you all want to keep that same group for pathway, for strategies and actions, you could, but.
I wonder if you just want to, if you guys want to do both, might be good just since you're going on that, maybe just do both.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, Erica, did you get those names okay?
I did.
Okay, next one is land use policies number 4. Jens, Chad, Joe, Chris. Okay, good. All right. And then last is housing, which obviously is Catherine. Who else would be on housing? Joe and Chris, are you guys hands up still for that? Joe, is your hand up for housing?
No.
Okay, so it's Chris and Catherine for housing. And then you too.
No, I'm wondering if we could include Carolyn Massa, who is our state hazard mitigation planner. She reports to Stephanie, and I think she'd be a good resource on 5.
On 5. I'm supportive of that. But I just don't, we need to, well, let's connect offline, because she's not listed as staff on the committee and she's a resource, but I think we want to be careful, so.
Right, okay, or just throw in Stephanie's name and let her engage on that.
Okay, so let's, Marion, you want to go back? This is very helpful. So Marion, can you go back to the spreadsheet? I think we should talk about what we're asking these groups actually to do. So, okay, so for each of you assigned, we'll come back to just the logistics in a minute, and then go ahead and put up this spreadsheet. Thank you very much.
So first up, it sounds like you want me to clean this up a bit more, so I can do that.
So you'll clean up a bit more, and then per pathway, just go to pick a pathway, whatever pathway you want, a pathway 1 say.
Wait, this one has the least amount.
Okay, what are we asking people to do now? So we're clear about the task ahead.
So, so I'll clean this up a bit more, and I'll start to sort of highlight that where I think there's overlap, or, you know, if it's under the appropriate pathway. This might actually be too small of an example, but I think what you all need to do, there are a couple tasks. One is walk through what you have for both strategies and actions ensure that they are actually strategies and actions. I think there are some strategies that are actually actions, or perhaps the other way around. So that's task number 1. Task 2 is to remove or consolidate any duplication. There may be a number of strategies or actions that are speaking to the same concept or the same program. Those can be consolidated. So that's task number 2. Task number 3 is, especially for those where you have a number of strategies without actions underneath, you need actions to really get to a strategy. So you'll have to build those out, and that may take more time. So I think for that process, being strategic about which ones you dedicate resources to, because that's where you're going to really have to do some critical thinking about what the actions will be needed to get to that specific strategy. Am I missing anything, Jane? I think then we'll want to come back together and think broadly across pathways, but that may be sort of the first 3 tasks for these specific pathway groups.
Just to why be really redundant here. So walk through and make sure strategies are strategies, actions are actions. 2, get rid of any redundancies that you can. 3, add actions where you have them missing.
Well, or even add, I mean, if you all are going through that, like I will point to pathway 3, for example, the only thing we have in here is develop best practice recommendations. So there may need to be additional strategies and actions under this particular pathway that you'll have to develop. So it's not only actions. I'll revise my statement there.
Okay. Let me go to Ben and Jens, and then Jane had some comment in the chat I want to get to, but Ben.
I just had a clarifying point about removing redundancy. Well, we want to remove redundancy within a particular strategy, but then we want to note that redundancy across pathways. So we want the group to read over the entire list and then add in a different column, a cross-reference. See also, pathway 3, strategy 4. Because it's those tasks or goals, or excuse me, tasks or strategies that cut across multiple pathways that might be the ones that are most important to advance in the near term.
Yeah, I think we discussed doing that as sort of the next step in this process, but I do think you have a point, and I think if the team or the pathway groups are looking at a specific strategy or action that you all think is relevant to others, I mean, I can add columns in and you could just put an X next to those, but I think that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I heard incorrectly, but we were going to do this at the pathway level and then come back and look at it across pathways so we could start to identify, well, this is really a primary strategy for this pathway, but it has co-benefits and is sort of referenced in these other pathways as well. Did I hear that wrong?
No, I think that's what Erica suggested. That's correct. Jane, did you want to?
I think what Marion just said was really right on, because I think at the point, I think for now, keeping things, strategies under multiple pathways is okay for this exercise. But as we start to think about how you roll it into the climate action plan, I think you're really going to want to know where the primary pathway is that strategy is benefiting, and then be able to narrate, like to qualitatively describe its co-benefits in another way that we'll start thinking about with drafting. But I don't think there's going to be the space or bandwidth to have the same strategy across many pathways. It just nuanced a little different for each pathway when we pull together the cumulative plan. So recognizing the role of where it's primary pathway, and we're going to talk about this a little later on the agenda around land use, but that's the effort and interest of why we're going to start to pull together a group to cooperate on land use action development, because it, of course, is impacted by or is coming up in emissions reduction, sequestration as an action for many that has many benefits. But where does it primarily sit, and how can we alleviate it from other folks to actually see that work through? And then I was just sort of asking, I'm not very clear, and maybe Marion is, but I'm not on what the cleanup is still to do here on this spreadsheet for Marion. And I'm wondering if there's more like of a structural, like first cut that would be helpful for Marion to do, that isn't like cleaning and deleting and organizing, but more about something a little more functional about that primary pathway and highlighting the strategies where they're overlapping. So the authors can be the ones to determine where they actually live and what the final words look like on the paper.
Marion, I don't know if you had any more thoughts about cleanup, then I'll go to Ben in just a second, but no, okay.
No, I'm happy to do cleanup. I don't want to step on your toes, or the toes of the pathways groups. So.
Let me have one more task to add. I think if anybody thinks a strategy or action is mischaracterized, it shouldn't be in that pathway, it should be in another pathway. You should probably identify that. That's just one more task of the good ones Marion listed. Ben.
Thank you. I was just going to ask if we could click on pathway 5 to see what strategies are there for a moment. I just want to see what we're dealing with here. Do we have the strategies? And do these crosswalk to other pathways? I haven't had a chance to study that yet.
We haven't identified any that crosswalk to other pathways yet. That's going to be a later task, if that's what you're asking.
I think we're going to do that a little bit later, but people have a chance to scan that and identify a few, and just to note, I think it's good to start thinking about that because it's also just a lot to go through. Won't be our primary task, but okay. So then the question is, let's talk about timing. When are we asking our folks to do this, and then coming back together to kind of see where they are? And Eric, I don't know if you have a sense of timing on this.
Right. So we had discussed this next meeting. Well, we discussed the option of actually utilizing the time for our next meeting next Friday since it's already scheduled for the pathway groups to get together and further refine this. And then the week after would be when we would come back as a big group. So you'd have 2 weeks to do develop, draft, and refine strategies and actions to be able to present to the group in 2 weeks. We could use next week's Friday meeting as an opportunity to for those folks to get together. You don't have to necessarily use that time. You can do it outside of that time, but since it's already scheduled, and we would want to know today whether you want to actually do that. So in case you need some Zoom meetings set up or whatever. But we had mentioned having a meeting next week for something.
Right. I was gonna tune up the goals, make sure that they were, I mean, they will probably still be revised once we start populating. So, I'll just a progress print, I guess, on the goals.
One option you could do, there's a little challenge. I know some of the subgroups on pathways are actually same people would be in multiple ones. So this is where it'll be a little bit tricky. But one option is to do a full Zoom meeting, start to do the first half hour over your goals, for instance, and then we could just do breakout groups within the Zoom meeting, and we could create the breakout groups per pathway, and you guys could be sent off to them. If public wants to listen into one, they can choose one. So that's another way you could just do it too, if you wanted to. So the question, I guess, for folks is, do you want to just you already have this time as allotted, so you just want to try to use it? And some of you may just have to choose which one you go to of the subgroups for now, or do you want to have separate meetings that someone kind of schedules and you do that whenever you can over the next week?
Well, the breakout groups won't work for me because I want to be in a lot of them. So that won't.
Yeah, can you send out the list, Erica, after of who was on?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, what about if maybe we pre-designate a couple of pathway groups that'll have time to meet on Friday if you want. Otherwise, we can just say, you all have to organize and meet yourselves, understanding that you have a deliverable in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. That's a little unstructured, but
deadlines are plenty structured. You need to get it done. It works.
I mean, Eric, to your point, what I was thinking too is maybe we can find where there's redundant overlap of people. We can try to separate those out, right? However many there are, and then maybe the ones where we can have discrete folks into breakouts on Friday. We can do those ones on Friday, so only a subset have to kind of self-organize before.
Chris is on 4, so.
Chris.
Well, we can do Chris and Bronwyn. How about that?
and Ben's on a few.
Joe.
Yeah, I'm just going to suggest that it would be good if each of these pathway groups had a lead. And because I think this is going to be the kind of task that's, somebody really needs to take, just do all the work. To be honest with you, you're going to pull people together and everybody's going to give their feedback, but someone has to do the typing and thinking and, and lead people through it, because otherwise it's just going to be a confusing mess.
Can each
So-
pathway have staff support to do that?
That would mean, that
no.
would be Marion on 5 pathways.
I mean,
Well,
I
no.
agree with you, Joe. I mean, it just seems like, let's figure out who the lead is, and that person should just work and then lead that conversation with the group to
So
make sure that
let's-
they're on the right track.
Let's do it. So pathway 1, who is the lead for pathway 1? And Mary,
So who we have signed up for pathway 1 is Ben, Jens, Catherine, David, and Chris. And we can't assign it to Catherine or David because they're not on here.
Oh, but we can.
okay, pathway 1.
My point.
If
I
you
feel
want
like
to
that's a
assign me to
Catherine
one,
pathway.
feel free to do so.
On one of my, okay, I'm assigning you, you, there you go. Thank you. Okay, that's, okay, pathway 2.
Hold on, I need to write that down too.
I can do that too for you, Erica. I'm putting it in chat.
So pathway 2 has Chad, Joe, Mike, Ann, Chris, and Ann and Stephanie are staff support.
You say-
I'd love to lead, but there's just no way I got way too much on my plate already. So I got some
I think
ideas,
we all
but I
have
don't
some
think I can
issues
lead.
there.
Yeah.
Can you say the names again?
It was Chad, Joe, Mike, Ann, Chris, and Stephanie.
I mean, I'd be glad to do it. I think, we're just not strong on the energy stuff, but
Yeah, we can pick you up there, Joe.
Yeah, we're
I'm not strong on any of this other stuff, so other than energy. So
And frankly, the task here is just basically taking the lead on doing some of the writing. Really, you're going to be taking everybody's feedback and, so just making sure that the strategies and actions are clear.
Right, so it's probably coordinating the time to get together, kind of helping kind of get through the matrix.
yeah, there's logistics of it.
Yeah, it was logistics. Okay, pathway 3.
So that was Joe.
Oh, that way, I thought pathway 2 was Joe. Oh, did I mess that up?
No, 2 is
thanks,
Joe.
Joe.
2 is Joe, 3 is,
3 is Ann, David, and Chad.
Chad, did I see your hand? I thought I saw your hand.
you did, yeah. I got,
Ann's over here hiding. Look at, we can't see you, Ann.
oh, there's-
I have to type, I have to unmute. Since,
make
no, since
David.
I'm the only, well, no, you're here, Chad. I could be the, it's basically the nagger, is the coordinator or whatever you want to call it. I'm happy to do that.
great,
Thank
you're
you
done.
very much.
Good. Pathway 4.
Jens, Chad, Joe, and Chris.
Oh, what about,
Chris, you're it.
do we have a staff person helping? I'm sorry. Is Marion going to be able to help? She's
Pathway
been.
3.
I
Mary,
was
if you-
hoping,
Pathway
I wanted
3.
to see where staff support for the subcommittee got us with the pathways, and Marion can certainly play back up if needed.
I
So we've
think
got-
3 we did not have a staff, right? Sorry, okay.
So we have staff support on 1, 2, and 5.
Oh.
3 does not have staff support. And
Ann-
4.
Ann volunteered. Oh. Which Ann?
Me and I'm the
Sub-
I'll coordinate or whatever you want to call it.
The coordinator.
And
Okay.
Chris, I'm happy to help with pathway 4 in any way that you need me to wrangle.
Yeah, okay, that'd be great.
Okay, pathway 5.
Catherine, Chris, and Ben/Stephanie/Carolyn will follow up on who the right person is.
Can we volunteer Catherine for that in her absence? I mean,
Yeah,
or,
I'm fine.
I mean,
She'll be back next week.
I,
We
otherwise
have
I'm not
we
gonna
have a
show up at
schedule.
meetings.
we have a scheduled meeting on Tuesday, right, Marion, where we'll follow up and maybe we can put that on the agenda so that we can catch her up and outline what's needed there.
And if she can't, we'll help with that.
And real quickly, just for Jane's point, do we have a clear state staff person assigned to each of these? Erica?
top 3.
I think 3 is the only one right now. Can you remind me what 3 is right now, Marion?
Reduction of
Or
fossil.
Ann?
It's the fossil
Oh,
fuel
reduction of
reduction.
fossil.
So there's a lot of work there. They need to do goals and build out strategies and actions.
Who's a?
So I can help. I'm already trying to coordinate setting up the goals meeting.
Okay, so Mary.
Yeah, I would also suggest perhaps someone from cross-sector as a staff. There's a lot of staff on cross-sector, and so maybe that carryover. But so yeah, let's talk about that a little bit.
Okay, and 4 and 5, Erica, do we have state staff on those?
Yeah, I was going to do 4, right? And
Yeah.
then 5 could be Stephanie, or did you say, or
Yeah.
or Stephanie?
Stephanie and/or Carolyn, I'm sure she'd be.
Well, looking at the list on 5, I think it should be somebody from ACCD if possible.
We're talking about staff support, though. We're not talking
Right.
about. Okay. I mean, I'm not really sure what we're asking our staff support to do. So,
If you actually had to someone has to go into the spreadsheet and be doing the work of cleaning it up and doing that. That would be nice.
Okay, I think we outlined I thought our lead coordinators were doing that.
Yes, that's what I thought too.
Yeah, I
Me
think
too.
When I mentioned staff, it was
Great.
to do the work of
I
the
think
lead.
Ann
but
wants
then we got
somebody, though.
leads.
yeah,
I can
One
help
pathway.
with pathway 3. So so Anne, I will follow up with you.
okay. But otherwise, again, you as
Marion.
committee members are going to be subcommittee members are going to be kind of coordinating, making sure the spreadsheet's up with people, entering things. If you have state staff will assist you, and you can kind of ask them what you need of them as you go. But you are kind of the lead.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I think you do have, I think maybe, what if we do this, Erica, just for scheduling purposes? What if we say maybe this group meets next week from 1 to 2 only to do whatever it needs to do? And that leaves 2 to 3 for someone to schedule a meeting if they want. And then we just know that this meeting the full meeting will just be for an hour. Does that work?
Yeah. And it sounds like by then we'll be talking about the refinement of the goals, and that will inform all of this other strategy and action work.
Right. And I think at that point, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, this won't be finalized, but the VCC will have a little clear direction about how to start thinking about prioritizing your strategies. So she can give a little bit of talk about that too, just a general sense. Erica, do you have a question about that?
I guess I have a little confused look because our folks are going to start prioritizing the strategies. So, are we waiting on more guidance on
I
how
feel
to
strongly that the way we've been talking about it, Marianne and I and others, is that there has to be this initial gut check that you are very much capable of doing now on your own, and that there will need to be at some level a more formal prioritization of actions and strategies to move forward with for this first climate action plan, but that you can do this first gut check of cleanup prior to your own recognition of whittling down now. Certainly.
And in some ways, you guys have done a pretty good job, and many of your pathways are already having done that, because you have kind of 5 to 6 strategies per pathway, and that seems doable, except for that one that has maybe 15 or 20. So that
There
one's,
are a couple that have 15 or 20.
yeah, so a few of those will need probably further help, but some of them are in decent shape. Chris, you were gonna.
Yeah, just a quick question of operation. If we think of some of our actions were outlined many months ago and maybe aren't even relevant or fully baked, can we just delete them, or do we have to keep a record that we deleted this?
I
think as a pathway group, you have control over strategies and actions and what's in there. I agree. I think, again, pointing to pathway 3, the initial task was to identify best practices for municipalities for fossil fuel reduction. And so the actions under there don't even make sense in terms of strategies and actions for the climate action plan. That should just be one action, is work on best practices for fossil fuel reduction. So yes, I think you should feel like you can clean those up, and that's part of that work.
What you might want to do is, if you do delete something, just do a red line strikeout or just note it something. It may be useful just to note it, but you certainly can do it. Wrong one.
Maybe organize it so it's here are the 8 out of the 20 things that we just put those at the bottom, right? And so it's visually, you can kind of quickly see what's out.
Bronwyn, then we want to go back to Erica. Bronwyn.
Yeah, I felt compelled to speak to this beautiful spreadsheet because it was something I had used for another project. And I just wanted to advocate. I think some people will look at a spreadsheet and be like, God, why do we have to do everything in spreadsheets? This is much better to edit in Word. So I just wanted to point out, I think the advantage of having a spreadsheet is that you can throw in some columns and you can prioritize things numerically. You can then say eliminated, you can say duplicate, and then you can sort and come up with your prioritized list without losing the original list that you had. So I just wanted to point that out, that that's why I like doing it in a spreadsheet, because it gives you that opportunity to start coming up with some categories and come up with that prioritization without losing the work that's there. And then it also allows other people to see what was sort of eliminated because it was a duplicate versus eliminated because it wasn't a high priority or whatever else.
Good.
It looks like you're in good company.
What's a spreadsheet people on this call?
I'm so happy because last time I used this spreadsheet, people were like, we hate spreadsheets. So
we're having this philosophical debate right now with CBI, with David Plum, because he hates spreadsheets, is what Marianne are learning, and we like them.
Erica, over to you.
I was just trying to move us along. Are we feeling like we're comfortable with the plan moving forward? Are there any other clarifying questions, or go ahead, Mike?
I was just thinking, for those of us that aren't on some of the other, are we using pathway teams? If we have recommendations for those other pathways, just to think of a way that we could throw something across, maybe we just send it to a lead.
Why don't you send it to me and then I can share those, just to be one person to consolidate that.
Okay.
And we want provocative things too, right? So just for instance, I was thinking of throwing to land use, all new construction utilities have to be underground for new buildings, new things like that, where rural towns don't have that. Some suburban towns will not let you build to a new home or business overhead, and obviously something to think about. I'll send it to you, Marion. Thanks.
Or even more provocative, we bury our existing lines. No, I'm just saying.
When we go to rebuild.
Okay, just to move on. Erica, I think we have 2 more agenda items. Is that right? We want to cover.
Yeah, and actually, I'll be handing them over to Jane and to Jane and Jane for those. She's gone.
Oh, she did. She did. What happened to Jane? Okay.
I can do the updates. I don't know where she went. I'll message her. Sorry.
Stakeholder engagement. Where are we with that?
So stakeholder engagement. So let me see we had a meeting earlier this week to talk about the rural community stakeholder event. So a reminder for folks, this is the sort of event or stakeholder event where we will be able to engage with, there's Jane, engage with folks from particular communities and sectors that we really want specific technical input on some of the pathways and strategies that you all have developed thus far. So we had a kickoff meeting this week with Catherine Morris from CBI, who's going to be the sort of facilitation and logistical support for that event, and decided on a date and time for it, which I have on my calendar and I can look it up.
It's the 15th, September.
Here we go. 15th from 6
Wednesday night.
You can take it away, Jane, if you want. You're back now. Okay, I'll keep going. So we met to discuss sort of the understanding the constraints of a lot of the communities and the stakeholders that we'll want to engage with. If you were involved with or had watched at all the stakeholder events that the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee put on with the Public Service Department, those were all-day events. The one they had this Thursday for the transportation sector was 9:30 to 3:30. So those were really kind of all-day events. I think this group that came together for rural communities really wanted to focus on those folks that may be doing work for their communities in a volunteer capacity. So shooting for that 6 to 8 p.m. time slot. Understanding though that that's going to be a 2-hour meeting, we're going to have to be really strategic about what gets put on the agenda for discussion. So we'll be meeting next week with the folks that were identified to work on that group, and Catherine Morris is helping to put together a rough agenda We're hoping to cover a couple of topics, but really start to get feedback from folks and not have too much presentation about, you know, if we're shooting for this particular goal in infrastructure, we're shooting for sort of this vision for resilience in our transportation network, what do we need to get there? And sort of phrasing questions for folks so that they start to get into what they would need to see in terms of capacity for their rural communities to really adapt to and be resilient to climate change. So we're meeting this week to nail down an agenda and start to think about the stakeholder groups to engage with. The other thing I'll identify is we're hoping to sort of co-host or co-sponsor this event, meaning that we just have folks that help message it on their own networks. And we've identified VAPTA, so the Vermont Association of Planning and Development associations, I don't know what the A stands for, VPA, so Vermont Planners Association, the Vermont Association of Conservation Commissions, and Vermont League of Cities and Towns to help promote this event, and hopefully having a speaker from Vermont League of Cities and Towns to sort of open up the event. So anything I missed there from folks that were on that meeting, or Jane?
I've just emphasized that I thought we were really focusing in on pathway one as sort of the gateway to most of the others, and that concept of capacity being critical to all the others. So I think there has been a little bit of thought of really narrowing it and focusing it there.
Yeah, thanks, Jens, for that reminder. So as we were discussing, sort of looking at the pathways and thinking about which ones would be most important to discuss, I think the common theme across a lot of these in terms of talking to rural communities is capacity. So we're really going to be focusing on, as Jen said, pathway one, and that question of capacity and what is needed to help communities in the capacity realm so that they can do all of this work. So thanks for that.
Mike.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say that I think we also are going to get help from the Rural Caucus. They are going to send some outreach out. And I got even more feedbacks yesterday, specifically from Vermont Leagues of Cities and Towns, that they want us to get something out quick, and it doesn't even have to be an agenda. It could be more just like one paragraph that says, hey, come join us. So I don't know if we can think about that maybe even before next week when we meet again, or it's probably not the end of the world if we wait till next week either. But I just wanted to get that, everyone thinking it could be just a quick invite without fully thought out agenda too. So that's what everyone's asking me for, in other words, when I talk to them.
Yeah, I do think that'll have to wait till Wednesday when we meet again because of the assignments that people were doing and about who the invitation is coming from, as well as that who we're inviting and how we're doing that. So we can have it ready to go and look at, and we can discuss what it says on Wednesday when we finalize it with the meeting.
And Mary and I privately chatted because I realized for across these three stakeholder group meetings, we probably want a little bit of common framing or messaging. So we'll figure out how to do that so there's some consistency. Okay, only because of time, we're getting close. We should leave a little time for public comment. Did you, Jane, want to talk about land use?
Just very briefly to let folks know that we have now scheduled a meeting for next week with just primary sort of leads in this area across ag and ecosystems, rural resilience and adaptation, and cross-sector, recognizing that land use is the key cross-cutting issue for emissions reductions, resilience, adaptation, and sequestration. And so there are a number of proposals and processes afoot to think about how we're going to draft the climate action plan. And in those processes, it talks about how we're going to raise up cross-cutting issues to make them more impactful in the climate action plan. But regardless of like getting to that place with a group of counselors and state staff working on that, it feels like the time is right at this point to start to coordinate on who's going to take the lead on land use, particularly recognizing that it's a key theme in transportation. It's a key theme, again, in sequestration and resiliency of the natural environment, and then here in the built environment as well. So that first meeting will really be focused on thinking about the climate action plan draft and where we speak to land use and how we do it in an effective way. And then hopefully lifting up and calling attention to where those strategies are coming to play, and hopefully delegate a home for that work going forward and a process for dealing with it, so that folks like Joey Miller and Gina Campoli, who are working on in the transportation space, and that's sort of a secondary strategy for them can sort of know that it's covered elsewhere and that we have a good process for how we're going to tie it all together in the cap. So just wanted to be mindful of that meeting and let you all know that that's coming next week, and should be able to report back out on some process around that.
Chris?
Since I assume all the other committees are going through a similar process of, prioritizing their actions, are we all going to be using the same template for something like land use?
Yes.
We're going to have to figure out how to sync those up across committees as well.
Yeah. Well, yes, we would like to see the same template. I revised the spreadsheets that we had put out back in June and asked people to use and sent them to me and David ahead of a meeting for us to talk about how we frame prioritization and the templates that we use to support that framework for early next week. So that's going to be a topic of conversation for the September 7th steering committee meeting in hopes of sending out a uniform template, but having that come from the steering committee and the council rather than me sending out templates, which I always felt like it's been received as well as if it's a council document being asked. And it really is at this point, we're moving so fast into the climate action plan that it's really going to be a benefit for us all if things are coming in a uniform way.
Joe.
Yeah, Jane, I just want to say or ask about this meeting next on the land use piece. I don't think anybody from transportation is part of that. You mentioned Gina and Joey, but they're not going to be there. But just as, we have a huge impact on land use. And I think that transportation does. So I don't know if I need to be there. I don't necessarily feel like I have to, but I just, to the extent that any recommendations are coming out and whatnot that affect transportation, it might be good to sort of have us connected in that some way.
Okay. Joey and Gina are going to be at the meeting. Did I say they weren't going to be at the meeting?
Oh, I thought you said they weren't. They were not.
No, they'll be at the meeting. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Good. All right.
The hope is that, as we think about a process moving forward, that in the transportation emission space, they may not be the direct ones drafting the actions, but that there'll be a tie back and we'll think through how to do that.
Okay.
I'm aware of time.
Maybe.
Sorry, Jane. Anything else? No. Marion, should we maybe see if there's any public comment and then close? So does anybody want to make a brief public comment before we close today? And just raise your hand on the raise hand function. Dale does. Good. Anybody else? Okay, Dale, over to you. All yours.
Thank you so much. And I will make this as quick as I can. I just wanted to go back briefly to the conversation about Pathway 4 on land use and the goals for that. I wanted to echo what I think it was Marion and Yen said about the importance of setting goals that are actually goals, that are ambitions, that meet the nature of the crisis that faces us. And specifically looking at what you have drafted right now for 2030, and noting that continuing to develop in places that are at risk of flooding is really just asking for trouble and wasteful. And we can't afford waste and we can't afford more trouble. Likewise, so at a minimum, I'd suggest making that a 2025 goal. And likewise, the 2050 goal, which you didn't talk about as much, but it talks about working in harmony to support the adaptive capacity of our natural systems and built environment. I think that is something that we ought to be aiming for a lot sooner than 30 years down the road. So I just want to encourage some rethinking on those issues so that they really are goals and things that motivate the change that we need. Thank you.
Great. All right. Anybody else want to make a public comment? Thanks so much, Dale. Appreciate it. All right. So just a reminder, next week, a 1 hour meeting only. Sort of work groups around the pathways are going to organize themselves. I'm sure Erica will follow up with reminder action items. We've got a lead for each, a staff for each, hopefully clear task. Marion, you'll kind of do any final you want to do with the spreadsheet and make that available to everybody as the thing to use.
Yeah, I'll send that out on Monday with a reminder for the task leads and work plan. So look for it for me.
Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Have a great weekend. Thank you all. Great work. Covered a lot today.
Thanks, everyone.